Hello and welcome. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conity Professor of Strategic Human Resources here in the ILR School at Cornell. I also serve as the Academic Director of our Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our CAHRS Fall Partner Meeting, which will be focused on post-pandemic talent challenges and opportunities. When we came up with the theme for this meeting back in August, we were indeed hoping that by December, the worst of the pandemic would be behind us. While it probably remains premature to say that we are in the post-pandemic era, there's no question that we continue to face a rapidly evolving set of talent challenges as well as opportunities. Over the past year, we have been on a talent roller coaster. Early in the pandemic, we saw record high levels of total separations, driven largely by layoffs and discharges, which was then followed by rapid hiring as the economy opened back up. Earlier this summer, a new set of challenges emerged in the form of record high quit rates and job openings, which continue to cause broad staffing challenges. As we all know, however, the numbers don't tell the whole story. There are deeper undercurrents marked by changes in employee expectations around things like work-life balance, flexibility, transparency, and meaningfulness, all of which are forcing companies to rethink everything from their EVPs to their total reward strategy. Over the past several months, CAHRS has engaged in several streams of work aimed at better understanding how our partner companies are navigating this talent landscape. We started this work with a series of 4 working groups that focus on how companies are rethinking different aspects of the talent lifecycle, from improving the candidate experience all the way through managing talent turnover and mobility. In early November, the faculty that led these various working groups summarized their key takeaways in a webcast, so I won't rehash them again today. However, if you're interested in viewing this webcast, we will be sharing a copy of these slides, and you can click the link that you see here below in order to watch a recording of that webcast. Today, however, we're going to feature another stream of work that we've been busy doing this semester, which is around the benchmarking studies being conducted by our CAHRS research assistants. In a moment, Jessica Hale and Sylvia Zamora will be sharing their study that examined trends and how our CAHRS companies are attracting and retaining talent in this challenging environment, specifically by re-examining their employee value propositions. Jeffrey Gaudier and Kim Gordon will then present their work examining how CAHRS companies are evolving their total reward strategies and how these changes are being influenced by the Great Resignation, the adoption of new work models, and other changes over the past 2 years. Following the student presentations, we're very excited to have a group of talent leaders from Boeing that will be joining us to engage in a panel discussion about how they've been rethinking everything from talent acquisition to total rewards to succession planning and leadership development. I think you'll find the panel discussion a nice illustration of how the trends and themes highlighted in the student presentations come to life in the context of a specific company. We would really like for today's session to be interactive, and it's set aside time for Q&A after each of the student presentations, as well as 2 points during the panel discussion. So please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function here in Zoom. We'll be compiling those questions and presenting them to the various presenters and panelists at the appropriate time. I would also encourage you to use the chat function throughout today's session to engage in dialogue with other attendees. You can share your own experiences or comments as we go along. So first up today, we have Jessica and Sylvia, who will be presenting their CAHRS benchmarking study on trends in talent attraction and retention. In a moment, I'll turn things over to them, but I'd first like to give you a little bit of background on Jessica and Sylvia. Jessica is a class of 2022 Mylar graduate with a concentration in HR and organizations. Prior to Cornell, Jessica worked for 4 years within the Indiana University system and has taken on various roles within academic affairs and student affairs. As a graduate student, Jessica has been a TA for the past 2 years and a research assistant here within CAHRS. Upon graduation, she'll be joining Royal Dutch Shell as an HR consultant. Sylvia is a dual MBA Mylar graduate student who will be graduating in just a few weeks here in December. Prior to Cornell, she worked for 5 years and has taken on various roles, including corporate strategy analyst, commercial strategy manager in the airline industry, and head of organization development in the oil and gas industry. As a grad student, she's been very active as co-VP of Corporate Affairs at our Human Capital Association, VP of New Membership at the Women's Management Council, and a student interviewer for Johnson's MBA admission office. Upon graduation, she'll be joining Amazon Web Services as part of their HR Leadership Development Program. So with that, I'll turn things over to Jessica and Sylvia.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So to get started, we are going to be talking about trends in talent attraction and retention. Next slide, please. So to provide a brief overview, we will start with short introductions, and then we're going to ground ourselves in the Great Resignation and how the transition to remote work sparked a rapid shift in the labor markets. Next, we will go over our research focus and methodology, followed by our research findings and recommendations. We will then conclude with post-research forward-looking questions, and then we will open the forum to some questions and answers and fruitful discussion. So I will pass it over. Oh, brief introductions. My name is Jessica, and I am a second-year MILR candidate with a focus in HR and O, and I will pass it over now to my partner, Sylvia.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to share our findings and our research with you all. I'm Sylvia Zamora, and I'm an MBA in MILR, graduating in a couple of weeks, as Brad just alluded. So before we dive into our research focus and also our findings, we want to take a moment to align on what the context of our research was, which is all around the Great Resignation. As we all know, the beginning of the summer, millions of Americans have voluntarily resigned from their jobs. This goes from frontline workers to up to senior executives. Only in September of 2021, over 4.4 million of Americans resigned of their job, according to the Labor Bureau. This represents close to 3% of the entire American workforce. And this is a phenomenon that it continues to carry over. And it's also a phenomenon that is not only happening here in the United States. According to LinkedIn, with over 800 million members across the globe, they've seen year-over-year changes of 54% higher on changing jobs among their members. So this is something that is definitely happening as the pandemic has reshuffled employees' prioritization. So trying to understand what's happening or what's driving these actions from the employee population, different market studies have outlined in 5 top reasons for this. First, super important, the burnout sentiment that it continues to grow. Second is a lack of flexibility that employees are experiencing on when and where to work. Third, are instances of discrimination, from microaggressions to more direct and aggressive aggressions that employees are experiencing in the workforce. Fourth is the sentiment that their contribution and ideas are not being valued. And fifth, the sentiment also that they have insufficient benefits. So when we started our research project, we actually asked our participating companies if first they have experienced the same high attrition, and if so, which employee groups were the most affected. So overall, our results of this smaller sample size are really much aligned with what we're seeing in the other external talent trends that other big studies have highlighted. So in the last 6 months, the participating CAHRS companies did mention that they are experiencing higher than usual attrition rates. When we dice the data across functions, 21% of this highest attrition is experienced among plant and manufacturing roles, followed by a 40% on HR functions. And the least impacted, at least for our CAHRS members, has been on administrative roles. Dicing the same data across different career levels, we see that the highest attrition rate or turnover rate has been on mid-career talent, followed by early career talent. And when we take a closer look at the underrepresented groups, we highlighted that almost half of the respondents said that they're struggling on retaining their BIPOC talent, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color talent, as well as their female talent. So with this information, we decided to focus our research on trying to understand what are the trends in talent attraction and retention that employees are facing to overcome the Great Resignation within their company. This research focus, we broken down in 4 items. First, understanding what the employee value proposition asks, how they're currently defining and what the key patterns and differences are. Second, we want to understand in lieu of the Great Resignation, what are the key changes that their EVPs are doing? Third, we also want to recognize and understand what are the main challenges that employees have identified and how do they plan to overcome them? And last but not least, tracking systems. How are companies planning to track the success of their talent acquisition and retention strategies? So with that, I want to pass it out to Jess to walk us through our methodology.
All right, thank you. So to briefly review our research methodology, we collected both quantitative and qualitative data to identify key patterns and differences across industry. Specifically, we surveyed 16 global companies. We interviewed 23 subject matter experts in talent acquisition, talent management, compensation, workforce strategy, and in our survey, we assessed organizational strategies, cultural attributes, levels of employee attrition and retention, implementation of new technology, tracking EVP effectiveness. And in our interviews, we focused on capturing data on key distinguishing features of an EVP, shifting employee expectations, and concluding our interviews with communication and listening strategies. Next slide, please. So without further ado, we would like to thank all of the companies who made this research possible and provided us with this amazing opportunity to learn more about the lasting impact the pandemic has had on the employment relationship and how companies are currently evolving. As you can see, our results are informed by companies across industries, including CPG, industrials, pharmaceuticals, finance, technology, and nonprofits. And now I will hand it back over to my partner, Sylvia, to talk more about EVP.
Excellent. So diving into our findings and recommendations from our research with the first bucket on employee value proposition. So here on this slide, you can see the top 5 responses that we received when we asked employers, what are the biggest challenges that they're facing within the labor market as of today? 92% of the employers mentioned that they see an increasing employee desire of work-life balance. And this is very much aligned with what I mentioned before on the growing sentiment of burnout, as well as the lines between work and personal life become more and more blurred. 70% of employees also mentioned that now that they have a flex policy and they have adopted remote work location strategy, their recruiting has actually expanded so they can tap into non-traditional tap markets. However, this has opened the door for new talent competitors that they have not faced before. 47% of employers, almost half of the employers asked, responded that they're struggling on understanding how to best retain BIPOC talent. 31% of employers also mentioned that due to the nature of their job, they have an inability to offer 100% flex work to their employees. And this has, as a result, drastically reduced their candidate pool, not just for appealing new candidates, but also on retaining their existing talent. And 15% of the employees also mentioned that there is an increase for demand of transparency and psychological safety as the bridges of trust between employee and employer are starting to break. So following these initial findings, we also want to understand how companies are establishing their EVP. So with that, 86% of the employers responded that they capitalize on their own brand and product to attract talent. This is a huge recognition that they're global companies, so they use their name just as a natural talent attraction. Interestingly enough, 43%, almost half of the survey companies, they responded that they do not have a formal EVP. That going back to the previous aspect, they leverage their own brand recognition as well as the size of the company to offer career internal mobility as well as great benefits, and therefore they don't need a formal EVP. 36% of companies also mentioned that that their employees' values are very much aligned with their CSR strategy, and that's a huge appeal for them to join the company. 31%, a little bit less than 1/3 of the companies responded that they do have a formal EVP external communication strategy. And only one company, which represents 8% of the participating companies, mentioned that not only they have a global EVP, but they also tailor their EVP to their critical talent personas or talent strategies. So with that, we also were curious to see how much does this established EVP is much aligned or misaligned with what employers think that are the expectations from their employees. So 70% mentioned that the employees are demanding local flexibility on when and where to work. 62% of employers mentioned that their employees are expecting more work autonomy and shift from hours of work to a more goal-oriented role. 38% of employees aspire to have values that are much aligned with CSR efforts. 23% want more agile workflows, as well as a transparent interaction across their organization. And according to employers, only 50% of employees expect their companies to have more bold DEI actions moving forward. So taking all these findings into consideration, we created a framework of 2 steps for companies to elevate their global EVP for global recognition, but also address their critical talent. So the first step of the framework that we developed is the global EVP. Definitely, we strongly recommend creating an EVP that is aligned with the business purpose, with the values, including any CSR efforts that the company might have, and also highlights what the employee experience will be. When you're designing the global EVP, think around employees as people and how can you more develop and help them develop, build their deeper connections across the org and across the teams. Help them provide flexibility, not just on when and where, if the nature of the job allows it, but also on how can they tailor their goals and their own roles to leverage their skills, but also their input and their impact within the organization. Allow them to create the personal growth opportunities within the organization, as well as to ensure that the benefits and the offerings within the organization are holistic to their well-being, as not just in the work persona, but also in their personal well-being. And lastly, consider taking action on how can they have more shared goals and purposes aligned. So having a global EVP, the next bucket or the next step for the brain framework is develop personas for that critical talent that will empower the organization to drive business success on the business goal fronts. So align your company's strategic workforce planning to the talent needs, and based on that talent need, define that persona, completing also some benchmark analysis on what are the best channels and the best ways to reach out to this persona. Tailor your global EVP to fit these roles, and with that, launch an internal and external compelling communication strategy within the proper channels that might not be the traditional LinkedIn and Glassdoor. So with that, I'll pass it out to Jess to continue with the next bucket of findings.
Thank you. So moving on to operationalizing global EVP within the talent acquisition process. Next slide, please. So as previously noted, we were very interested in what is on the horizon in light of these ongoing talent shortages. And we noticed some really exciting trends in the talent acquisition space going on right now. So specifically, over half of all of our respondents reported adapting in agile practices by tapping into new talent sources and removing those location restrictions. In addition, over half of our respondents reported taking transformative actions to improve BiPAC recruiting strategy. Specifically, most respondents reported increasing their partnerships with HBCUs and other historically underrepresented colleges. So to operationalize on that EVP, 31% of our respondents reported removing or revamping talent acquisition websites to refresh and provide a clear branding proposal, specifically putting all of their EVP offerings in one space for prospective talent to evaluate and be informed about all the EVP offerings a company provides. To execute on this strategy, 23% of organizations reported upgrading technology to reduce the manual workload and increase process efficacy. So in effect, some companies reported implementing new technology to remove identifiers to de-bias hiring decision-making throughout the talent acquisition process. And finally, a minority of companies reported conducting anonymous surveys to assess the candidate experience and set up real-time improvements for each stage of the talent acquisition process. So they are walking the walk and delivering on their EVP and setting themselves apart against their competitors. Next slide, please. So given our findings, we surmise companies need to execute an agile and analytical talent acquisition strategy to stay competitive. And here we provide a simple 4-step framework for organizations to follow to operationalize their EVP and stand out throughout the talent acquisition process. So the first step, talent. Draw those talent personas and reassess those role requirements to determine if those 4-year degree requirements are really required. Our respondents also reported removing those background checks and to open up new sources of overlooked talent. Also, removing those bias and barriers throughout the talent acquisition process through implementation of new technology. The next step, process through simplification. For example, reevaluating and cover letters are a key decision trigger item for your organization. And if not, perhaps removing those. Also, upgrading technology so current employees can devote more of their time creating a personalized candidate experience. Next step, moving on to location. Some organizations reported senior leaders choosing to stick to a base location or in-person return to work strategy, even when work could be done remotely. This was primarily due to the belief that cultural exchange can only occur in person and not through digital mediums. Yet almost all talent acquisition leaders reported digital natives are continuing to challenge this notion. In efforts to effectively recruit critical talent groups, these barriers need to be continuously reevaluated, and almost all TA leaders reported job postings that had no base location requirement had significantly larger talent pools than job postings with no base location requirement. Finally, the fourth step, tracking. So tracking those external perceptions can be a fruitful process in revising your formalized EVP. So for example, a few organizations reported actually engaging university students as early as their sophomore years in college and bringing these students together to explore employer brand perceptions and better tailor EVP offerings to future work talent preferences. Additionally, assessing every stage of the talent acquisition process and making ongoing improvements in real time, tracking first-year retention, offer acceptance rates, levels of attrition, and other performance indicators were frequently cited in concern of informing EVP effectiveness. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it over to Sylvia now to talk more about our findings in talent retention.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Jess. So this is the final bucket of our findings and recommendations, and it's all around talent retention. So here, our question was, what are talent strategy teams having the horizon in regards to talent retention? So again, the top 5 answers are on the screen displayed here. 69% of employers mentioned that they're either expanding or elevating their career paths offerings to their employees through either including mentorship and coaching formal programs, as well as rotational LDP programs for early career talent. They're also mentioned expanding their career paths offerings to beyond critical talent, but also to other talent within the organization. Almost half of the employers mentioned that they're offering self-service asynchronous learning and development platforms so that all employees have within their power the ability to skill build based on what their career aspirations are, and with that empowering employees to take control and charge of their own careers growth and development. Again, 31% of employers also mentioned that at this point, they're still trying to identify and navigate how to best create impactful and engaging culture and belonging remote activities, especially on how to revamp their onboarding services and programs at this point, especially for those employees that have been hired on a remote base and they had never stepped into the office nor met in person their managers. So how can they create an engaging and impactful remote activities for all of them? 22% of the employers also who are embracing technology at its most, they're mentioning that they're integrating AI into their skill building paths so that they can help each employee based on their career aspirations to tailor a specific skill building path to, again, continue with this democratization of learning development and empowerment of their talent with a growth mindset. And a very few percentage of employers mention that they are also creating stretch projects or also short-term gigs so that for critical talent, they can offer them not only the opportunity to tap into exciting or other teams projects, but also help them increase their network, as well as continue their skill building and project-based dynamics. And with that, continue that engagement and motivation and see how they can have a diverse career path within the existing company. So with these findings in hand, we created another framework, a 4-step framework on how can companies elevate their retention by empowering their community with a growth mindset, but also keep a connected work community all across geographic locations. So the first step of this framework is equipped. Equip your community to be ready to adopt this recommendation. So first on this step is to elevate your manager's emotional intelligence skills. Equip them to be able to have and navigate better these complex conversations that are rising across within employees, especially with empathic and resilient skill base. Empathic and helping them being able to early detect if there's an employee risk for attrition and act upon it. Second is also to train, nudge, and reward your employees regarding inclusive behaviors, definitely creating a more psychological safe place for all diverse employees and continue creating that camaraderie and engagement environment. And last on this item is create time for all those beyond the role activities that you might be creating for your company. Make sure that they're not siloed, but instead there is a framework or a space for employees to be able to really leverage them without jeopardizing their day-to-day activities. Second is connect. Launch a clear and frequent internal communication strategy when you feel you're communicating frequently with your employees, so they have that sentiment of trust and transparency all abroad. Also, try to ingrain psychological safety and belonging mechanisms within day-to-day practices like one-on-one meetings with managers or staff meetings or CEO Ask Me Anything sessions. And lastly, we also recommend organizing different networking events throughout the year. So go beyond professional, but also start developing that personal connection that creates a strong retention within the company for all careers, especially those mid and early career employees. Develop. We want to encourage all employers to normalize career conversations. This should not be a silo effect once or twice a year alongside the performance reviews. This should be a recurring base so that, again, employees see a clear path on how can they continue growing within the organization, even though it might be outside of their immediate team. We also encourage you to democratize learning and development through an L&D platform. And within the developing bucket, we also recommend either offering a gig marketplace where employees, especially that critical talent, can continue expanding on their network and skill building. But if you launch a gig marketplace, we strongly recommend make sure that there's a system to allow them to allocate time and also their readiness on PM skills to navigate and not feel overwhelmed on this gig project. And last on this framework, track. We love tracking, so we strongly recommend you to keep tracking. Track your employee sentiment either through nudges or pulses for specific functions or locations. And along those trackings, make sure that you do share the results with the employees alongside an action plan so that there's not a sentiment on behalf of the employees that they're just responding surveys but seeing no actions or no follow-ups. And lastly, in this area, continue analyzing your voluntary attrition and exit interviews and try to see if you find any patterns. And if so, act immediately to stop that talent flu. So with that, I'll pass it off to Jess to walk us through the summary of our frameworks.
Yes. So next, I'm going to walk us through a roadmap and provide a summary of recommendations that we have emphasized throughout our presentation. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, we provide a quick breakdown of a successful talent management strategy in this new dynamic labor market. So going over this is a summary of all of the frameworks that we just went through. We focus in on 3 key areas. First, EVP. Second, talent acquisition. And third, talent retention. The first and foremost, formalizing that EVP to define strategic talent needs within the next 5 to 8 years and drawing those talent personas based on those needs. Next, looking at talent acquisition and customizing those EVP offerings to fit strategic talent needs, humanizing the process, and rethinking location strategy. Finally, moving on to talent retention. It's essential to equip your people, provide opportunities to connect, and provide internal infrastructure to sustain a dynamic talent management strategy. Next slide, please. Oh, and finally, track all of it. Okay, so here we provide a summary of a 5-stage process to elevate a firm's EVP. And it's focused on in recognition that every organization is at different stages within their EVP journey, and they're presented with unique opportunities. We recognize that this framework is fluid and some may go back and forth throughout the process. Nevertheless, first developing that formalized EVP to provide a focused human capital strategy in alignment with organizational strategy. Second, drawing those personas for strategic talent and creating, third, creating and developing that new talent environment for engaging employees to where they couldn't imagine working anywhere else. And then fourth, adjusting and refreshing that talent acquisition strategy while being mindful of internal and external communication strategies going on both within the organization and outside of the organization to make sure everything's in alignment. And finally, tracking every stage of the process, creating those SMART goals, tracking ROI and other performance indicators, and adjusting offerings in real time as necessary in order to stay on top of the market. Next slide. So moving forward, after building a framework and a roadmap that is fluid on the insightful feedback that we have gathered, we realized there are still so many more questions to be answered and posed for interesting future topics of discussion. So in essence, how are firms utilizing organizational design and work design to catalyze that work-life balance that employees are craving so much? And also, how are they building this compelling communication strategy that is enhancing trust among employees who have never stepped foot inside of an office before? And then what type of cultural activities are the most impactful when you're trying to create a sense of belonging within an organization? And then finally, in efforts of continuous improvement, how are organizations most effectively monitoring and evaluating their EVPs? So with this concludes our presentation. Thank you for being here, and we'd love to open it up for some questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jessica and Sylvia. Very nice job. We've already received a number of comments highlighting, appreciating the insights that you offered, as well as kind of comments that this presentation aligns with the thinking that's currently happening in many organizations. I think your presentation is definitely on the mark. I'd like to take some questions. Some have already come in. Certainly welcome any other comments or questions. Please submit those through the Q&A function here in Zoom or chat, and we'll field them. So one question is just kind of a methodological question. How did you determine the SMEs in your research? I think the question is kind of, how did you figure out who you were going to interview as part of this research?
Yeah, I can take that. So all of our subject matter experts were heads of talent acquisition, talent management, heads of workforce strategy, and in some cases HRCOs. So most employees have been in this space for a very long time, had a myriad of experiences, and were truly a wealth of knowledge that I can't even give like justice and service to all of the rich findings throughout our research.
Great, thanks. So another question is, can you share more about how companies are using AI to enable skill building and career pathing? Did you hear any kind of specific examples or kind of implementation of that in any of the companies you talked to?
Yes, I can get us started with that answer. So that's a great question. So what companies mentioned that they're doing at this point is working with a third-party vendor that is centralizing not only the LinkedIn profiles from many employees across functions, across industries, but also with that mapping out what a CHRO would look like, what a CEO would look like, what that trajectory has been in their background, and also what skills have been required to get to one step and then next phase and next phase. So with this centralized information, what companies are adopting through this third-party vendor is allowing employees to connect and create their own profile, either using their existing LinkedIn or creating manually their profile and lining up what their career aspirations are. So what this AI software is doing is connecting, okay, you're at this stage right now, this is where you want to go. And based on this whole library of information that we have gathered at this point for internally your company, but also externally, these are the skills that we're recommending you to do. So that creates a more tailored career path for their employees to know how to skill build accordingly to reach to that goal.
Yeah, just in addition to that, I believe another finding in terms of how they're implementing AI is these AI platforms are actually informing talent, based off of the skills and competencies that the technology has assessed each employee has, these are actually the positions within the organizations that employees are qualified for and should apply for, so they can continue to kind of take some personal initiative and like owning their career paths into the future. So I thought that was super fascinating as well in terms of how they're implementing AI.
So another question we received is, do you have any research specific to early talent, or can you kind of talk about maybe the range of different talent that was kind of the focus of your benchmarking?
I would say that at this point, there was no specificity regarding early career, mid-career, or later in career. I think at this point, it's just how can we encompass a strategy regarding attraction and retention that is tech native, as many of especially early careers have grown up with technology at their access on their hand, but there's no specificity. So I think I would say the frameworks that we have developed, as well as the findings that we gather, are applicable all across the board, including early talent.
Yeah, I would just highlight a little bit when talking to talent acquisition leaders, the focus on creating more diverse and inclusive organizations through recruiting through non or untraditional sources of talent in terms of the HBCUs and other historically underrepresented colleges. So they've seen an increase in that, but also creating those early talent rotation programs that really establish a sense of belonging through that mentoring and coaching. Knowing that early talent has these people that they can kind of count on to help them, transpire and acclimate to an organization in a non-remote setting. Most TAs said those programs, when done well, are really sticky and help keep talent in place for a long time.
That is so true. And just to add one final idea, CSR, it's definitely a growing sentiment that it's really important for early career talent and understanding and believing in the value purpose of the company, as well as what their external agenda is to support the community or the environment. So I think communicating very clearly strategically what the CSR is doing as a company will be a huge attractor factor for early career talent.
Great. So actually received another question from one of our former CAHRS RAs. You mentioned that the roadmap is fluid, but is there a reason you placed retention before acquisition?
Yes, that is very true. It took me a little bit to get to this slide, but yes. The idea that why we place talent retention a little bit ahead of talent acquisition, and this is a back and forth, as we mentioned, this is a fluid roadmap, but why talent retention first? We want to make sure that you have a compelling and engaging work environment already for your existing talent. So when you have position and strengthen your talent acquisition strategy and you bring in new talent, they're going to be engaging and they're going to be joining a very exciting and already fulfilling that EVP promise walking in, instead of having a slower risk of maybe focusing first on talent acquisition, bringing in the talent, and have the risk that they will be leaving within 6 to 12 months later because the promise was not delivered to what they had anticipated. So I think it's very important to first focus on the talent retention, retain the talent that you already have, and then focus on bringing in more talent from the market.
So one question is around kind of the theories that you discovered in your literature review that drove your frameworks or recommendations. And I think based on our discussions, as you looked out there in the literature, I mean, I think EVPs are one area that hasn't really been as studied in the academic literature, and certainly maybe not in this current environment, but maybe you want to speak a little bit more to kind of the literature that you drew on.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. That was actually my favorite part of the project, is understanding historical precedent and how we got here and where we're at right now. So Brad is definitely correct. In terms of finding EVP, in terms of the Great Resignation, academic papers have not yet caught up with the emerging trends. There was literally like 2 papers, and they were very specified within the healthcare industry and within the technology industry. Nevertheless, the idea of the EVP came into play in the mid 1990s with this war on talent. And so needing to create these branding proposals for, highly sought after talent in these critical talent groups, which is kind of in line with, the progression of just HRM within organizations as a whole, where strategic HR management really came into play in the mid 90s. And then so just capitalizing off of that, unfortunately, like Brad said, there has been almost no up to date within the past 2 years, significant findings about employee value propositions in light of the Great Resignation and kind of the rapid shifts we're seeing in the labor market right now with the transition to work remote.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And I think that's why this type of work is so important, for that just-in-time kind of perspective on these issues, and hopefully us academics can catch up here shortly. Another good question that came in is, you talked a lot about the, creating more time for people to learn, more coaching by managers, rotational moves, more connection events. And the question kind of gets at this maybe tension that creates with expectations around productivity, because all these things are great, but they also may take away from employees' time and managers' time just to get work done. So was there any discussion as you talk to different companies about how they're kind of thinking about, or maybe rethinking, traditional notions of productivity or performance expectations as they seek to kind of expand some of these employee value propositions?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Feel free to chime in, Sylvia, if you have anything to add. But yes, I think overall the consensus among the CAHRS companies that we surveyed, which is not representative of the US as a whole, but almost all the companies reported that they're hitting their performance goals out of the water right now. And really the sentiment was really focused on burnout, and also just reanalyzing what performance management means in this new employment era. So focusing versus more on hours worked to goal oriented. Our study unfortunately wasn't focused solely on performance management, but the question is totally valid in terms of all of this free time, but rather the idea was upgrading talent and keeping talent engaged through these gig markets, these talent markets, to enhance networking, increasing engagement, with the idea that creating times for these type of activities, in addition to cultural activities, to connect to an organization, kind of builds that loyalty to where an organization tends to outperform their competitors as a result of having just these distinguishable features that are not easily replicable in the market. And if they were, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So I think it's a great question. But overall, among CAHRS partners, the issues was not managing performance. It was more about managing the sentiment of burnout among employees.
Yeah, and just to add to that, something that within the research, but also outside of the research, what I've seen, it would be a 2-part answer. First, on how can you, as a company, make the workflow more agile, reassess what goals are you setting for employees, are they all really necessary or not, or just building layer over layer over layer of work. So I think addressing and trying to think how can you create a more agile work will help streamline the operations, and hopefully with that gain time for their employees to go beyond the role activities. The second part answer will be thinking a little bit more, how can you build psychological safety? So through psychological safety, we'll be able for employees to raise their hand if they're hitting a wall, or ask for help a lot faster, instead of trying to repeating errors, instead of just asking help for a peer, asking help for a manager. And with that, get that coaching, get that training, save time, deliver results much rapidly, and with that, have more time for other extracurricular activities. So I think it's a combination of agile workflows, but also creating that camaraderie and that it's okay to ask for help, it's okay to make mistakes, but streamline that so that people can finish their day-to-day job faster and focus on other activities.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. One question that came in that I'm going to kind of park for the moment is, how big of a factor is compensation and retention? And I think our next presentation by Jeffrey and Kim will certainly be getting at that as their focus on total rewards. You know, Jessica and Sylvia, one question was, how often should a company review their EVP? Was there kind of a typical rhythm that you saw across companies, or did it maybe vary by, you know, across companies based on different factors? What would you suggest here?
Yeah, it seems like a two-part question there, and I'm happy to get started. So in terms of compensation, definitely Kim and Jeff are going to be elaborating, and their research is just as fascinating as well. I will comment that among our study, most companies reported, you know, reevaluating compensation, but not emphasizing it in their formal EVPs in terms of money isn't typically what keeps employees loyal to an organization. And then the flip side of that question, can you remind me again, Brad? I'm so sorry. I lost my train of thought.
So how often should companies review or refresh their EVPs?
Yeah. It was interesting, and I was actually surprised about this. It seems like a once a decade thing for the most part. A minority of organizations, I think all organizations said our first priority for 2022 is reevaluating our EVP and refreshing those brand proposals. There was a minority of organizations who reported this is like an ongoing continuous process where they evaluate it through every step of the process to make these real-time improvements, to make sure all of their communications throughout, you know, their digital formats, their social media, their web pages, all of it is consistently in line, and they're walking the walk of everything that their web pages and everything that they're communicating is saying. And I think that's what really spoke to us the most, is that level of transparency and that level of evaluation in terms of making these real-time improvements that are allowing them to kind of outcompete their competitors in terms of getting that critical talent they need to, you know, push their organizations forward in this new economy.
Great. So one question that came in, which I can answer, is, you know, basically they're asking, did study involve employees to gain their kind of pulse and sentiments? And the answer is no. We would have loved to have done, you know, kind of broader surveys of employees. We were really relying on these talent management experts in the companies to be our kind of source of what they're seeing or hearing from their employee bases. But, you know, one last question, Jessica and Sylvia, is the question is, did you hear from companies differences in level of resignation across different geographies? I think, you know, a lot of the companies you were talking to, or you were largely focusing on the US, but did you hear from them, any of the multinationals, how they may be seeing differences globally in the Great Resignation, so to speak?
So that's a great question, and it's something that we definitely address. At this point, most of the answers were geared to the American population or the US based, but they did mention that they have seen the strongest, higher levels of attrition here in the United States and in some other areas of Asia. But mostly it's been concentrated here, and most of the answers and the findings are geared to the US.
Yeah, it was really hard to make it conclusive findings. I think the challenges and opportunities of the pandemic created unique, you know, needs for organizations across talent in terms of their critical needs. So it was, there was no general trend in terms of that. But interestingly enough, I do remember talking with talent acquisition leaders in Italy and in India in terms of their levels of attrition among women tended to be lower than here in the United States, which I thought was fascinating. They didn't dive in too deep in detail. So obviously there's definitely variation across companies and industries to where there was no really conclusive findings in that space.
Great. So I think we need to move on to the next presentation. But again, Jessica, Sylvia, thank you so much. Great findings. I think definitely resonated a great deal with the audience here today. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Great. So next up, we have Jeffrey and Kim, who will be presenting their research, their benchmarking study on the evolution of total rewards. So just a quick background. I know Jeffrey and Kim are going to share a little bit about themselves, but I'll give them a little bit of introduction here. Jeffrey's second year Mylar, graduating again in a few short weeks here in December with a concentration in human resources and organizations. He started his career in finance and HR for 7 years before coming to Cornell's ILR school. After graduation, he'll be joining Johnson & Johnson's experienced HR leadership development program. Kim is a second-year MILR student with a concentration in international and comparative labor. She worked for 6 years in data analytics and consulting before coming to Cornell's ILR school and is interested in the intersection of data and HR. And after graduation, she'll be joining American Express in their global HR rotation program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey and Kim.
Thanks, Brad. So we are very excited to be here this afternoon and discuss our research on the evolution of total rewards. So if we jump to the next slide, we'd love to begin with a little bit more detail on us. As Brad mentioned, I'm Kim. I grew up in New Jersey. I studied engineering. I did my bachelor's at Penn, and I worked for 6 years in data analytics and consulting. And I came to the ILR school at Cornell to pivot a bit, learn more about HR. And I'm really excited to join American Express after I graduate in May. So I'll pass it off to my partner, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to share some of the results of our research with you today. My name is Jeffrey. I'm originally from France, and I thought that the picture on your right might make it even more clear that as I hold some French bread from the bakery. I attended Brigham Young University and graduated with a bachelor in finance. And I went on to work in finance at Goldman Sachs and New York Life, transitioning to HR as I moved to World Fuel Services based in Miami. I'm currently a second-year Mylar graduate student at Cornell, and I'll be graduating in just a few short weeks. After graduation, I'll be heading to Johnson & Johnson as part of their experienced HRLDP development program.
Great. So if we jump to the next slide, today we're going to be discussing our research objectives, our methodology, our findings, a framework that we put together, and we'll close with opportunities and questions for the future. So we'd love to begin with a bit of context. Our research was really anchored around 3 main pillars. First, we wanted to understand how have the expectations of employees evolved with respect to compensation and benefits in the past 2 years. Then we wanted to understand in more detail how specifically have total reward strategies been changing and what were the drivers of these changes. And then finally, we wanted to know about the external context. So to what extent has the Great Resignation or increased levels of attrition impacted these total reward strategies? So to do this, we interviewed 28 leaders in both the benefits and compensation sides of an organization in 18 companies. And these companies spanned over 9 industries in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And company size ranged from 1,000 to 200,000 employees per company. So our general approach was to consider external research and then combine quantitative survey data with qualitative interview data, bring it all together, do analysis, and prepare insights to share with you all today. So before we dive into our findings, we just wanted to take a minute and thank all of the companies that made this possible. We really appreciate your engagement and participation. Jeffrey and I have had a wonderful experience, so thank you so much. So I will now pass it off to Jeffrey to begin talking about our findings.
Thank you. So based on our qualitative and quantitative analysis, there's 6 key themes that have emerged. Number 1 is total rewards changes, then communication, work flexibility, environmental, social, and governance evolution, monitoring inflation, and finally attrition. And so we'll discuss those in more details in the next few slides. And we'll start that with a discussion on total rewards changes. On average, we saw 2.2 changes on the compensation side, while 6.6 changes on the benefit side. And this was really in line with what we learned from our qualitative interviews, where we saw companies having increased reactivity and benefits. During our conversation, We were also fairly surprised to learn that there was little impact in compensation frameworks, despite the rise in remote work. On the right side of the slide, we have some of the most common changes we saw in compensation and benefits. For compensation, companies reported increases in short-term and long-term incentives and home office expenses. One example for one company reporting making changes to short-term incentives for their sales employees based on a shift in sales from one channel to another as they adjusted to the COVID pandemic. For benefits, companies reported that there are more options to family support, mental health, and alternative work arrangements. One company used an application to build a gamified approach to well-being that encouraging engagement among employees. Shifting to our next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about communication. We found that 82% of companies changed the mechanisms they use to track employee sentiment over the past 2 years. And this included, for example, going from quarterly or yearly surveys to a monthly pulse check. In another example, a company set up forums and focus groups to address employee questions in public forums, for example. So as companies updated their tracking mechanisms, they also changed how they communicate with employees, with 53% of companies changing the way they communicate about benefits. And this is, again, something that we saw more pronounced around benefits than we did with compensation. And that's something that we confirmed in our qualitative interviews as well. Moving on to work flexibility, we found that most companies still operate in a hybrid or fully remote model. However, on the manufacturing side, this remains mostly in person, mostly out of necessity. And so while companies were not able to be location flexible in this area, we found that they were looking at ways to provide other flexibilities to bring a more equitable environment for on-site employees as compared to office employees. Some of those examples tied to flexibility that we heard in manufacturing, they include maximizing virtual training where possible, investing in new technologies for shift management, like shift swapping, providing alternative schedules, and using job sharing, which allows multiple employees to work one job. And so with that, Kim will walk us through the rest of our themes.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So the next two themes really center around conversations we had with leaders in the compensation space. So on the left here, we discussed mostly with public companies, environmental, social, and corporate governance metrics and how they're tied to compensation. 72% of companies that we spoke to said that they're either thinking about it or already have something in place. The main groupings that we kind of heard were some companies were saying, almost any conversation with the board involves talking about ESG, but the next step is quantifying it. Others were saying we do have metrics, but they're more of a kicker or secondary to financial goals. And finally, some companies were sharing that they have ESG metrics more integrated into compensation, but for a smaller scope of employees, for example, limited to executives. So in these conversations, a few key priorities came up. First, it's important to align ESG metrics to the business strategy so that it really makes sense. And this is why companies have shared they're kind of in this flux of defining and prioritizing. Scorecards could fill up quickly if metrics are across all these different areas. So one company, for example, with a big manufacturing presence shared that what they view safety as mission critical. And so what they've done is they hold leaders accountable to injury and fatality counts, and that is in both annual performance and compensation. Another company shared that they use more site or localized based metrics to create incentives for their employees. So thinking about productivity, quality, and safety measures. Another thing that came up was time frame. So one company shared that they only make ESG goals over 3 years. And then at that point, if they meet those goals, they broaden them. So we found that quite interesting because it definitely aligns to the idea that ESG is more about long-term thinking as opposed to driving short-term profits. And then the last item here is thinking about broadening the scope of who is impacted by ESG. So one company, for example, shared that they have diversity metrics in their performance management. This applies to employees at all levels, but the more employees that you manage, then the more heavily those factors would be weighted in your performance and compensation. So on the right here, we also discussed inflation. 62% of companies reported that US inflation is a concern and it's something that might impact their compensation budgets in the future. Generally speaking, most companies seem to be in this monitoring and kind of observing as opposed to acting right away. They shared that inflation has a bigger impact on minimum wage employees. So there's a lot of analysis about cost of labor versus cost of living and where they fall in the market, especially knowing that there is a labor shortage right now. With respect to healthcare, employers are aware of rising costs, and so they're thinking about ways that they can either absorb those costs or potentially pass them on to employees. And then finally, some companies that had an international base, they shared that they already had processes in place to work for companies that where they see these bigger spikes in inflation more regularly. But even so, they had this a bit more of a conservative approach and a wait and see. So again, monitoring, but not necessarily acting on it. And some reasonably mentioned, well, we claim inflation when it's high, but if it's lower, we don't necessarily want to take that away from compensation. So they're still thinking to be in there. So I will now turn to the last theme, which is about attrition. Most companies we spoke to have experienced higher attrition recently. That is consistent with the higher level of movement in the labor market. So it's something they've been monitoring. But with that said, about 71% of the companies we spoke to said that they saw higher levels of attrition, specifically in manufacturing and field, especially sales roles. And so we wanted to understand how have these changes impacted total reward strategies. Well, 82% of companies did say that attrition was a factor in, evolving these strategies. However, in almost all of our conversations, companies were sharing that, they view total rewards as only one piece of the puzzle, and that there are other factors that drive attrition or are important to consider when thinking about value proposition. So some examples of other drivers of attrition include the employee-manager relationship, changes in senior leadership, which can shake up organizational culture, a lack of progression or trajectory, and the importance of flexibility and perhaps employees not being met where they're at. And in response, some examples of things companies are doing, in the total reward space, there is some benchmarking of salaries, counteroffer assessment, but more on a selective basis. And they're also doing other things such as investing in training, thinking about leadership development, and changing the way they track sentiment and communicate with employees, as Jeffrey mentioned. And that really leads to increased transparency. So this really ties into the framework that we developed. So I'm going to pass it again to Jeffrey, who will elaborate on what we can do with these findings.
Thank you, Kim. So based on everything that we learned in the study, we put together a framework to help our CAHRS partners assess where they're at with their total reward strategy and how they can move towards improved retention, engagement, and commitment. For that, we identified two key dimensions that are transparency and flexibility, and classified companies from established to evolving and finally differentiated. And we will address each dimension in the coming slides. So starting with transparency, our first dimension, we classified our participating companies and found that 39% were established, another 39% were evolving, and 22% were differentiated. Now, across the transparency dimension, we found three focus areas: performance, communication, and the total rewards framework. We found that as companies move towards transparency, they increasingly tie performance to compensation metrics, and they cascade those metrics down to all levels of the organization to align business strategy. Now, for communication, we found that as companies transition from established to differentiated, companies increase the number of touch points when sharing information about total rewards. While most companies sought to have consistent total rewards framework, differentiated companies had a fully integrated and consolidated total rewards platform. And so we also wanted to share some key examples that we found across participating companies that were evolving or differentiated. One example was the consistent reporting of ESG metrics to both employees and shareholders. Another key example was a pay equity review with proactive steps taken to address the findings. And then finally, another example of company that established a benefit concierge service where employees can call in and discuss their benefits options. So now I will turn it over to Kim to discuss flexibility.
Thanks. So the flexibility dimension is all about employee centricity and total rewards, and also thinking about work models, because we know that flexibility has become more and more important in the past 2 years. So we classified 39% of companies we spoke with as established, 50% as evolving, and 11% as differentiated. So first we can think about how compensation decisions evolve. In the established category, we're thinking more about decision-making being based on market data in a rather structured timeline. Moving to evolving, that's when multiple inputs come into play. So perhaps reacting to where employees are leaving, tighter integration to performance management, thinking about that mix of pay. And also, some companies shared for the first time they were doing these kinds of things outside of the traditional merit process. And then the more differentiated side is being more proactive about compensation decisions. So basing it off of highly needed skills or pockets of skills that will be needed in the future. Now, in terms of benefits, established companies offer competitive offerings. They're willing to reallocate or shift around based on usage and feedback. The evolving space, we're seeing more leading benefits and the addition of incremental offerings as well to really add more value. And then the more differentiated side is moving towards more customization of benefits so that employees can pick and choose, and it's more catered to their specific needs. So thinking about employee demographic there. And then finally, with work models, establishes the more traditional flex approach with some structure. So it could be 3 days at home, 2 days in the office, with an approval process to kind of divert from the norm. The evolving is a more flexible hybrid approach where employees have more say of when and where they work. And then moving to differentiated, which is fully remote and full autonomy. So would love to also give examples of that we heard that fall into the evolving or differentiated categories. So first, I mentioned the proactive compensation decisions. One company that's not a tech company wanted to invest in more advanced analytics capabilities and modeling. And so thinking about, okay, what are the skills we need for this type of group? How are they being paid in the market? What's the right shift of compensation or mix? And how can we get there, to build out this team and bring in that talent? A second example is a company that not only increased the cadence of their pulse checks and surveys, but also created multiple forums to get feedback. So you have the town hall, or ask me anything type session, but also smaller, more intimate focus groups where employees could really share their experiences. And that was being used in decision-making for benefits. And then the third example was a company that decentralized their governance a bit in the compensation area to give more local leaders authority to approve incentives or benefits based on the needs that they were seeing with their employees. So all of these findings and this framework we've just described really establish some key opportunities for companies moving forward. So we jump to the next slide. As companies think about ESG, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about how to really tie it to the business so it makes the most sense, and how to weave that into performance management so that it can impact more employees in the organization. Then secondly, the importance of being proactive in total reward strategy. We've observed a lot of companies sharing, how they've been reactive, but not as many shared ways that they were getting ahead by doing controlled experiments or doing certain analyses. And we think this should be the norm. And then finally, simplification and consistency are key in messaging. So employers should continue to find ways to provide digestible information about total rewards offerings, and to do so in a consistent way to really hammer home the point and enable employees to take full advantage of the offerings that are already available to them. So with this, I will pass it off to Jeffrey again to talk about questions for the future and close us out.
Thank you. So now looking ahead, as CAHRS partners look to focus on their total reward strategy, we've identified a few questions to consider for additional research. We found that many companies were struggling with outdated information when looking to benchmark. And so question one would be, what new data points should inform compensation decisions when a highly evolving market makes benchmarking data less valuable? Many of the companies we interviewed were either considering or already implementing ESG metrics into their executive compensation frameworks. And so with question two, how can various ESG principles be integrated into management decisions beyond executive compensation? Now, companies have brought various levels of flexibility into their benefits program, but many remain skeptical about fully flexible and customized benefit offering, given the loss in economy of scale. So question three, how practical are fully customized benefits given the loss of economies of scale? And then finally, as we discussed in healthcare inflation, it's higher than ever. And so with that in mind, question 4, says, how can healthcare inflation be effectively managed in a volatile environment? And so with those questions to consider, we're going to close out our presentation and on the evolution of total rewards, and we will open it up for Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeffrey and Kim. Very nice job. Again, lots of insights, great information there. Certainly a very kind of dynamic area that companies are wrestling with right now. So I would love kind of questions from the audience. Some have already come in. Encourage others to please submit your questions, and we'll field them here in our Q&A session. So one question, in your flexibility framework you talked about kind of, I think it was an evolving category, kind of leading benefits. Can you just provide a little bit more information about what is a leading benefit, and maybe provide some examples of leading benefits that you maybe encountered in the companies you spoke with?
Yeah, so a lot of companies shared kind of using peer groups or different market comparisons to decide where they want to go. We heard things such as expanding parental leave to 12 weeks, changing bereavement to a more personal leave, so broadening and kind of taking away the explanation tied to leaves, having kind of mandatory company-wide PTOs or thank you Fridays, and kind of covering new areas of medical that haven't been covered before, such as gender reassignment or fertility treatments, and a lot of family support offerings as well, to kind of think about people who are working and home with kids, as a few examples.
Yeah, I think overall, what we see is that companies are listening more and more to their employees and trying to target specific populations. So when you think of the examples that Kim mentioned, I think the idea is to focus on areas where in the past maybe were benefits that were kind of for everyone the same. And now we're moving to a model where, we're listening to different, maybe underrepresented populations or different pockets of need within the organization.
Great. So, under the opportunities, you highlighted the idea of being proactive, and the question that came in is, how do companies balance kind of being proactive with also making sure maybe they're not being quote unquote faddish, right? We're just kind of chasing the latest thing. We want to be kind of nimble, but we also don't want to be changing our kind of benefits structure every 6 months based on the latest thing. So how do you suggest companies kind of balance that need to be proactive with also maintaining some kind of consistency or stability?
One thing I could start off with is a company that had more differentiated like flexibility in this case, shared adding a bit of rigor around how they made these decisions. So having controlled experiments and kind of testing out hypotheses. So, it is this balancing act of what you're hearing others are doing, what people say they want. And of course, the number one thing you can use is like usage and what people like and don't like. But that was one way that they kind of added another level of complexity and were more proactive.
Yeah, so I think the approach to being proactive it does not necessarily mean changing it every so often, right? It means having a cadence that you establish where you're proactively looking into the market and seeing what other companies are doing and what are kind of the next iteration of benefits that can be available. And so it's more so balanced. Obviously, it's a balancing act between, always changing benefits, but also something that you're regularly updating and reviewing, not something that you're doing when you feel like you're behind the market or you're not, where you're kind of reacting to what the situation is currently.
Yeah, I think both of those are great suggestions, having that regular rhythm to it, and also having some data behind it through these pilots or experiments to really kind of inform which of these changes is going to be most impactful. So another question that came in, really says, really like the simplified framework. Will inflation play a critical role in compensation strategy, and will inflation impact long-term decisions? I know you noted that a lot of companies seem to be kind of in a wait and watch mode, but maybe based on what you heard, what impact do you think inflation might have here down the road?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that we talked a lot with companies and tried to understand. To a certain extent, we found that a lot of companies are, at least when we're talking about US inflation, have found that this inflation is transitory and not something that is necessarily permanent. And so with that in mind, they're taking a conservative approach. Now, that may change as this inflation can continue to happen, right? And so we see kind of what we discussed between the international inflation, where we've seen countries like Brazil or Argentina that have had high inflation for many years, right? Those have established framework, right? Based on, they have COLA adjustments each year to manage that. And so those type of processes might be adapted to the US if that inflation would be persistent. But for now, we're seeing companies being conservative about it.
Great. So another question, are there specific examples that you can share for how companies are engaging their workforces around the kind of ESG metrics that you talked about, when maybe their work doesn't naturally really tie into those metrics, right? I think some of these make more sense in certain types of work or certain industries more so than others. So, how do companies that maybe where it's not as obvious, the kind of line of sight, how do they manage that?
Yeah, I could start. So one aspect too is even just the naming of it. A lot of companies are actually thinking about social metrics, or for example, the DEI space, and thinking about how they can move forward. And so they are actually working towards similar goals, but maybe not necessarily naming it ESG. And it seems to have the first connection to executive compensation, with a connection to speaking with boards as kind of like a low-hanging fruit of how do you model, basically encourage people to model behaviors and drive forward certain areas. But it did seem that like the prioritization is important. So not having to feel like you have to tackle all the areas of the E, S, and G, but really thinking about what could be mission critical or what already is baked into what they do, and starting with that in a more long-term way as well. So kind of starting slow and measuring from there.
Yeah, and another thing that I have heard, and we've heard from companies, is really having checklists in how you're making decisions, right, based on certain criteria. So besides the metrics that you establish, which is one way to kind of establish this ESG framework, is also how you operate and how you make decisions on a regular basis. And so as companies go from just having metrics on the executive level and dropping those down to kind of larger company, it's also a way of operating, not just a way of having metrics and checking those metrics.
That's great. So another question here from another one of our former Mylar our CAHRS RAs, which is great to see. Did the companies you talked to mention virtual hybrid work as being more of a permanent benefit, or are they still in kind of a mode of stay virtual or hybrid, as long as we have to until this is behind us? Basically kind of asking, based on your conversations, what do you think the future of virtual work, hybrid work might look like here once we are in the post-pandemic era?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that is something that to a certain degree we struggled with, right? Because in doing this research, there are still a lot of decisions that are not finalized, right? They're up in the air, or there've been kind of frameworks that have been started, but aren't necessarily going to be permanent. And so I think my personal opinion, and I'm sure Kim will share hers, is that what we're seeing is that, yes, companies are moving to a more hybrid model, right? So companies that were previously looking to go back into an office-centric model are kind of, for now at least, staying in a more hybrid model, right? So we're seeing a shift. However, I don't think that will land in a place where this will necessarily be permanent. And so there's going to be a range, right? Companies that will obviously firmly remain into the remote world, and other companies that will be more office-centric. But even within that range, I think there's a slight movement towards more flexibility.
Yeah, I agree. One company, which was just one perspective, even said, well, if we shifted so quickly to this hybrid, who's to say we can't shift quickly back out? Like this already is a proof of proving out something that we didn't think could be done. So there's still unknown about like what the real future is. And I don't know if companies necessarily considered it a benefit, but across the board, companies, were sharing about the ways that they supported their employees in adjusting and making it work, providing alternative work arrangements. So yeah, it's interesting to kind of see where it pans out. But the last thing I'll say is that, with that said, we also know that on the employee expectation side, there is this, increased value of flexibility. And so that does go hand in hand with a more hybrid approach.
Great. So I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here because one of the kind of open questions you posed was, how do we make compensation decisions when maybe the benchmarking data that companies have been so reliant on is really outdated? And I've heard this from a lot of HR leaders, right? As they're thinking about, compensation budgets for next year, they're using data that's a couple years old. It's really not relevant to the current situation. And so I'm just curious, did you hear any kind of approaches or strategies from the companies you talked to about how they're managing that, or maybe other ideas that maybe you just have for how to kind of wrestle with that dilemma? Or you can say it's maybe something we need to address. It is an open question. That's fine too, but curious.
Well, definitely is an open question that we were curious about as well. One company I remember shared, it seems like companies have really relied on market data and also kind of their peers and have moved together in a sense when it comes to compensation. But in the past 2 years, there's been less consistency even there, because one company shared, well, everyone seemed to say that they weren't going to increase merits, and then in the end companies did. And so if you weren't one of them, then you somehow were behind. So it seems that there's going to be perhaps more self-determination of what's right for the company, and also more flexibility about the when those decisions are made, and also the levers that are being pulled. That's my perception based on what we heard so far.
Yeah, I think that part of this is going to be bringing additional sources of data that are going to be gathered directly by the company rather than going through third parties, right? So finding your own data points that might help you in making that decision. And another thing, when you think of inflation impacting compensation, and in the future in the US, that might be a big deal, right? Depending on where we go. I think that what we find is that you might find intra-year adjustments, right? Which has not been the norm at all in the US historically. But that's something that we've seen with companies that are in markets that are a lot more inconsistent. And so that could definitely be something that happens.
Great ideas. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Another one came up. It says, this study concludes that compensation reward changes were kind of twice, benefits were twice more than the kind of compensation. Are these benefits, are they monetary benefits or non-monetary benefits, or kind of a combination of both in the terms of where you saw or heard changes in companies?
Yeah, I think we could definitely say it's a combination of both. But what we've seen, right, and I think that's the big difference between compensation and benefits, is that overall during the pandemic and exiting the pandemic, we've seen a general, right, again, this is general, increase in spend and benefits. And so with that came with additional benefits being offered. Whereas compensation, we didn't see necessarily an increase. Obviously, case by case basis may be different, but overall, I think it was not just a reallocation of spend in benefits; it was also an additional spend.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is it seemed that there were certainly adjustments in compensation in reaction to employee needs, but the fundamental framework and way of thinking changed less. And in benefits, there was a bit more reactivity in that space.
Great. So maybe one more question. I imagine a lot of the people kind of watching your presentation there maybe working in this space, and I think you've given them a lot to think about. But as you really kind of think about what are the critical needs, the priorities that should be top of mind for total rewards professionals trying to navigate all this complexity that you've laid out for us today, what would you suggest?
Well, one thing for sure is one of the questions we pose as well, but really this balancing act between flexibility and economies of scale, because that full customization does, there are trade-offs there, but how can companies be a bit more tailored to employee needs as a way to drive extra value? And that could be with voluntary or opt-in benefits, but also kind of the more creative approach. And a lot of companies seem to say this is on their radar, but that it wasn't something that they're doing right now. So we identified that as something kind of top of mind to think through and plan for.
Yeah, and I think one of the takeaways that we talked about was being proactive as an organization within the total reward space, and I think that's extremely important. Because if you're not being proactive, then you're constantly having to look at what the market's doing and react to whatever is happening, which I don't think is a good position to be in. And so for companies that choose to be proactive, they can have regular cadence of kind of looking at what's happening and taking time to evaluate whether a benefit offering makes sense for their organization, which is a much better approach than trying to be reactive to, a direct competitor or someone in the same industry.
Maybe one more question that just kind of popped in the Q&A. It deals with transparency, kind of did you hear from companies kind of the debate maybe between full or partial transparency, kind of how much transparency is the right level of transparency, particularly when it comes to compensation? I think we probably can all say, pay secrecy isn't maybe a good strategy, but how much should we really be kind of sharing out there and communicating when it comes to things like pay?
Yeah, I think that's, so first and foremost, I don't think we have anything specific research-wise, like numbers to highlight that, but that is definitely something to balance, right? And I know our framework talks about increased transparency leading to better engagement, retention, and so that's definitely what we've seen, right? But each company is going to have to decide what that looks like for them, right, within their culture. And I think that's something I guess additional from the framework is you have to also understand where the culture of the organization is at, and based on that culture, have a transparency level that matches that culture as well. And within that level, obviously, greater transparency will bring in better, retention.
Yeah, I totally agree that the linkage to culture makes sense. And I'll just add that one company shared that they added their ranges for each role on actual pay stub so that every time you could see where you fell in the range with respect to your level. And they said that, candidly, there were mixed results to that, and that they saw more good than bad, and that's why they did it. But, you have to deal with the aftermath of people being surprised or maybe having inflated egos being at the top, and how does that work interacting with others? So that was interesting because that did come up.
So I know I've said one last question. I'm going to say it one more time because we just have one more, which I think is a good one. I think a lot of companies thinking about what, benefits are specifically being offered around flexible work. I think you highlighted kind of home office, kind of support. Were there other specific benefits that companies talked about for those kind of flexible hybrid remote work arrangements?
There was kind of shifting from, on-site cafeteria to HelloFresh delivery, accommodating the home life. There was some with actually childcare. So being mindful of, there was a service to kind of like supplement childcare. And then also a lot of, we heard a few times partnerships with Bright Horizons for tutoring as well. Those were a few that popped up.
Yeah. And then once we get into like fully flexible benefits, we did hear from one company that offered a stipend of money for, I think it was for cell phone use, right? And we've seen that of multiple companies as well, but that's kind of where it could move to, right? In terms of flexibility, the idea that you'd have a stipend spend for benefits, and then employees would be able to choose what to use that spend for. And that could be one way to do that.
That's great. So I'm not going to do this to you again. That was the last question. Excellent job. Thanks to both Kim and Jeffrey, as well as our earlier presentation by Sylvia and Jessica. Really always amazed by the great work that our CAHRS RAs do for us. And I think everybody certainly took a lot of valuable insights away from your discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So with that, we're going to now shift gears and we're going to welcome our panelists from Boeing. We're very fortunate today to have a group of talent leaders from Boeing joining us to talk about how they're addressing various talent challenges and opportunities created by the pandemic. The panel is going to be moderated by Michael Cox, who is the Vice President of Human Resources for Boeing Defense, Space, and Security, and also serves as the Global Head of Executive Talent for Boeing. A little bit about Michael. He's responsible for developing and executing a best-in-class executive talent strategy, which includes attraction, assessment, and acquisition, along with talent management practices that ensure Boeing has the necessary executive talent and bench strength to retain its position as a global industry leader. Prior to Boeing, Michael held various HR positions at Comcast, Walmart, eBay, Bank of America, and First Data, and has had a rich kind of global experience as a HR leader as well. So we really appreciate him kind of leading and guiding today's discussion. So with that, Michael, I'll turn it over to you to introduce your fellow panelists and get us started on the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Brad. And thanks for the opportunity for us to come and share today. I've been on the call for the two presentations, and I think what I could easily say is, let's just all listen to Sylvia, Jessica, Kim, and Jeffrey, and we'd be good to go. The good news is, I think through our panel discussion and through the questions that the participants will ask, we'll be able to demonstrate how we bring the things to life that the two presentations have just captured, as well as share some real life lessons learned at the Boeing company. So I'm very pleased to be joined by four of my colleagues from Boeing Human Resources. Pam Hennard is our Senior Director of Global Talent Acquisition. Pam's been with the organization coming up on 4 years now, but does an incredible job leading a global talent acquisition function to meet the talent needs of Boeing. Just to put that in context and let you know what Pam has on her shoulders today, Pam has over 15,000 openings globally that she and her team are working with our business leaders and HR partners to fill. Our next panelist is Greg Marchand. Greg is our Senior Director of Boeing Global Benefits. Greg has been with the organization for 27 years, despite his youthful appearance. He is responsible for leading and making sure that our benefits do exactly what Kim and Jeffrey just talked about, which is attract and retain the talent to Boeing as an employer of choice or a lifetime employer. Greg has come up recently with some very cutting edge benefits that we believe are really leading the market when it comes to attracting and retaining the talent that we've talked about. The next panelist is Carmen Reynolds. Carmen's been with Boeing for a little over 4 years now. She is our Senior Director of Boeing Leadership Development. She is responsible for partnering across the business with our business leaders and HR professionals in making sure that our leaders have the knowledge and experiences that they need to grow their careers and meet the business needs of Boeing. And then our final panelist is Tiffany Verzino. Tiffany is the Senior Director of Boeing Executive Talent Management. She's been with the organization for 17 years and does an amazing job in making sure that we have the right talent in the right spots at the right time at the executive level. She's led projects like our succession planning project, which I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about today, where we have revamped and really modernized succession planning for Boeing, as well as performance management, org optimization, and other work. So I will tell you, Brad, and audience, I could not be more proud of these four individuals and the work that they do, and really excited to give them the opportunity to highlight some of that. We thought the format for this panel, and Brad did such a great job at moderating the two presentations. He set a high bar for me, but I thought what we'd do is we'll go through a couple prepared questions. If you as participants have any questions, please feed those into the chat, and I'll do my best to bring those in. And then we'll go through some other moderated questions and then open up to any final questions that anyone may have. So really looking forward to an interactive dialogue here. But with that, I'll turn it over to the panel of my first question. I think, Greg and Tiffany, let's start with you. So, you know, one of the things that the prior presentations have both talked about is in this period of a hyper war for talent, as we're competing to get the best talent at Boeing and fill our positions, we just saw in the headlines today from CNN, there's over 11 million openings in the US alone. So we're competing for talent in a scale that we never have. So going back to the retain and attract that talent, Greg and Tiffany, how does Boeing differentiate itself to make sure that we can retain and attract that talent that we need and continue to build the strength of a robust talent pipeline? So Greg, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael. So first of all, I'd say everything stems from our strategy of how we design our total rewards. And as part of that, we want to demonstrate a culture of care to employees and their families every day. We want current and future employees to receive a level of care and benefits that they don't get anywhere else, and that fit in with our, our Boeing mission. We, state very explicitly, we want to be a lifetime employer. So we design what we offer to employees to help meet that goal. And then lastly, I'd say we want everybody to be an owner. And there's lots of ways to create ownership, but we do it currently deeply into the organization, every level. I think that, that helps create the culture that we want, so that we're driving performance and value from, what we contribute to the enterprise.
Excellent, Greg, thanks. Tiffany, let's go over to you.
All right, thank you, Michael. Hey, building off of what Greg was saying from a talent perspective, a career transparency is key in what we've been making changes in Boeing, and define career transparency as a clear communication and knowledge. As me as an employee, I know that I can grow in the company, and I know how the company is going to help me grow and develop. Some examples of changes that we've made recently this past year and what we're looking to further develop in Boeing, executive postings in Boeing, we've historically not ever presented. It was kind of behind closed doors that leadership would decide, here's who's going to be an executive at Boeing. End of last year and coming into early 2021, we went full on our internal job board, posted our executive openings. What does it mean? The requirements we look for our executives. So that is very transparent and open for our employees both to apply as well as to understand what skills and knowledges are needed to be ready to be in the executive positions. Michael had mentioned performance management. We took, beginning of this year, more of a traditional performance management where you're rated at the end of the year by your boss on goals, and flip that into performance enablement that is really addressing where an employee comes forward with, here's my career interest and development, and sits with their manager and has ongoing conversations, removing that scoring aspect in performance management. So those are some of the ways that we're looking to be more open on in our career transparency.
Excellent. Thank you, Tiffany. So next question, I think I'll go back to you, Greg, and then to Pam. So we know that recruiting talent happens long before the requisitions open and the conversations start taking place. Sylvia and Jessica talked about the employee value proposition, which we know is critical. We have acknowledged in this post or towards hopefully post pandemic talent marketplace that these challenges are even further amplified. Can both of you talk a little bit about how we attract and hire that key talent or that required talent for our business? Greg, let's go to you.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, I think it starts with, ensuring that we clearly communicate how we differentiate ourselves. I mean, our value prop is often about having the best 401k plan in the country, the best tuition reimbursement program, and very inexpensive healthcare with a goal of making it even less expensive for employees. So kind of start with that core. We need to get better at simplifying and marketing what we do really well, but then begin to talk about, things that positively influence and impact the diverse and inclusive workforce that, we want to attract here. And, that creates then the need to provide everything from, really unique behavioral health benefits to backup care, to tutoring benefits, and really look from a diversity lens like we've never looked at it before, and really design things from that perspective. And then, ask employees what we're missing or ask them to help us with the design. I think we often make a huge mistake in thinking we know how to provide what everybody wants. We need to seek out what people value and then include them in the design wherever possible.
That's a great point, Greg. I think when Kim and Jeffrey were doing their presentation, they talked about the simplicity of benefits and people understanding. And I think that's a lesson that Boeing just learned as we rolled out our, what I would consider market leading benefits in terms of financial benefits, with the 100% match up to 10%, the 2% bump for the next 2 years, but communicating that in a way that our employees understood, and it caused them to want to stay with the organization. Pam, how about you? How are we looking to attract and hire that talent that the organization needs?
Thank you, Michael. I think while the act of hiring talent has relatively remained the same, with a few caveats related to virtual work for us, the manner in which we engage and attract talent is actually changing. I mean, one of the things that we've learned in the post-pandemic market is that candidates don't just want to be marketed a job. I mean, we all know there are plenty of help wanted signs and ads everywhere. And I think the headline that you shared, Michael, from CNN really points to that. People know that most companies are hiring. What we found is that, more often than not, candidates and individuals want to understand even more about the company, the work they're doing, and what's in it for them. And so there isn't just one thing we're doing, but it's a multitude of things that we're willing to try to determine how we can get talent earlier and also be agile in how we think. And so there are a few things I'd share, that we've been working this year that's been really important to us. One of them is engaging leaders and individuals outside of HR to be ambassadors for our brand, and sometimes the first point of contact or engagement for talent. We've always known that it's important for talent to get to speak with and talk to those that are doing the job earlier. So we've tried to use events as an enabler. We've invested in our events team and our capabilities so that for our critical and difficult skills, we can use the incredibly smart and talented leaders in new and different ways. So we've been hosting speaking engagements with our technical fellows so they can talk with passive talent on what we're doing in space, what we're doing with satellites, and even sometimes what we're doing in diversity. And I think it's really incredible, if I think about it from a candidate's perspective, to hear about, what is low Earth orbit, and what products are launched into space in that orbit, and then what types of roles are available. We even have events where we share the impact of, what local community organizations have on employees at Boeing. And so this means we might not always get an immediate hire through these events, but we know that we have to establish relationships with talent in a new and different way. We do, however, understand that events have to be accelerators in our ability to hire, and so we also do those hiring events. The second thing I would say is we take all of the things, the great work that Greg shared about the changes we're making to our benefits program, and we're using that and distributing that within our talent network. And we're also making it part of our brand story. So our talent network becomes really powerful for us. We can engage them with the events, we can talk to them about the jobs that are happening, but we can also share great stories about how diversity, equity, inclusion is woven into the fabric of the company, or how they can come to Boeing and I think, live the best life they can with the benefits and the things that we do. And I think the third and final thing is really just focusing on increasing the pool of candidates. This has included intentionally removing degree requirements from roles across the enterprise, to recognizing the power that contract labor or gig workers can play in supplementing our workforce, increasing the utilization of SkillBridge, the SkillBridge programs that we have to ensure we can capture veterans before they leave, which is important in us being able to show the amazing work people can do at Boeing. This is just a short list, but the idea that we've learned post-pandemic is we've got to be more agile and sometimes even more planful in how we're going to market and attracting and engaging talent.
Pam, I think that's excellent. Thank you, Greg, for your input there. I think the interesting thing for Boeing, just for our audience members, we have experienced, we're over 103 years old as a company. We have experienced the benefit of people aspiring to work for our company for years, and us being that talent destination. And kind of like when I introduced the panelists a while ago, there are a lot of people at Boeing who have been here 25, 30 or more years. We have been their employer of choice for their entire professional career. Even now, though, our attrition has gone up, just like we've talked about for all the other companies. We are still well below a lot that you would compare us to, but we're still up from where we were. So this has been really top of mind for us in terms of how do we retain the talent we have in this competitive market as we're changing, plus to Pam's point, how do we attract? Carmen, I'm going to go to you for one question, and I'm going to go to some of the questions we're getting from our participants. So once that talent joins Boeing, how do you and your team intentionally engage them kind of throughout their career to upskill their skills, knowledge, and capability for their future as well as for Boeing?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Michael. And I think it builds on what Pam said. I love hearing how there's so many connections and there's handoffs between us as HR professionals, but we want that experience to be seamless for our employees. So engagement really begins before a start date. And one of the things we've shifted to is sending some Boeing gear to our new employees' home, and included in that is a postcard that not only highlights resources to start exploring around career development, but it also shows our hashtag, which is everyday learning at Boeing, a new one that we've deployed, because our goal is to drive curiosity from the start and make sure that we're not only making people curious, but also providing them with a really wide variety of resources that they can go and explore. Another big shift for us has been moving from event-based general learning towards more personalized learning journeys. It's really a marriage between succession planning and development because it takes intentional actions to fill gaps that we might find. And so examples are, if there's someone who is needing additional global experience, we might do and recommend a job rotation. They may lead a global project or even connect with a mentor that is leading in that global space. And it could be a variety of things with a variety of levels of commitment, but still that intention there to come in and fill those gaps. And in some cases, it might be a combination of all of those things over a period of time. So really our idea is just to build on that strength and really upscale our team members for the future.
Excellent, Carmen, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to some of the questions from the participants. The first question is around, can you speak to your early career or early talent compensation and benefit strategy? So Pam, let's start with you from an early career standpoint. And then Greg, maybe we'll jump over to you for the benefits and compensation part.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we understand that some of the skills that we're looking for, we have to start early. And so there is a lot of intention from our business and in the organization to invest heavily in the work that we do on college campuses at a variety of different external career fairs and events to tap into talent, even as young as the sophomore year. I mean, one of the biggest things that we found in working with partners like Thurgood Marshall and others is that the idea of having immersion with students before they actually join, giving them access to talent is, and to Boeing and to leaders is incredibly important. And it does create a sense of interest. It creates a pipeline for us, and we've been able to successfully tap into that pipeline, right, and convert talent. But I think it's really important for us as we get folks into the door that we're also still engaging them and finding ways that their careers are developing through our rotation programs and other pieces that give them access, of course, to that continuous learning that Carmen was speaking about.
Excellent, thanks, Pam. Greg, how about you?
I'd like to answer that from a couple of different perspectives. One is just really trying to understand and to study, what employees are seeking during different phases of their life and career. I mean, early career, I would point, generally to two things: free healthcare, and really wanting to, support learning. Both with everything that Carmen was talking about, but then through tuition reimbursement, because we know a lot of people want to seek additional certifications, degrees, or get their first degree, and enable that to help people, be really successful. And then I guess the other perspective is, again, really seeking and listening when we have teams at college campuses. I've been really surprised over the last year how many people have asked, what are your behavioral health benefits? I'm not surprised at all that that's an important issue. I'm just surprised by how many people have asked. And then, really making sure we're willing to talk about those things.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. Tiffany, this next question is going to come to you. As you can imagine, you mentioned performance management a little bit earlier as one of the major bodies of work that you've done. What did the change management look like moving to our performance enablement environment? And then what early successes or opportunities have you seen with this approach?
Yeah. Performance management is such a hot topic in our HR field. A lot of companies keep coming at it. I don't know that we yet have secret sauce. So beginning of the year, we had a 2-point rating system where at the end of the year, performance management, a manager rated their employee on goals. And then we had a secondary rating system where managers would determine their employees' base pay increase and bonus. So the flipping what we did on performance management to performance enablement is to take the approach that an employee is interested in growing and developing in a company, and that their goals, the discussion with their leader on their goals is more of, how am I doing? Do I need more support? Do I need other development? Am I missing? Am I spot on? Is it too easy, too hard? And so we wanted to remove that concern and fear and holding back on the scoring aspect and drive more development, and hence even relabeling performance management to performance enablement. The end year scoring with the salary base still is in place, but the focus on enablement, we're still on the journey. I'll just say that change management is incredibly hard. I don't think you can ever over rotate or plan when you're trying to shift 125,000 folks, and that includes our non-union manufacturing. And we had put this as a 3-year change project. So the early wins, we have a lot of feedback coming in that this is both employees and leaders like the concept, like the idea. How do we actually do it? And learning it as a new muscle, a new way of how employees and managers interact is going to be a continual work in progress for us.
Tiffany, I also want to just recognize you and your team, because you did a lot of benchmarking with external companies, including working with Gartner and others, to figure out how we could kind of do a step function change in our performance management system, that we were going from so traditional to now hopefully market leading or practice leading in terms of performance management. So I know we also, as an organization, we accepted that we weren't going to go from where we were to a perfect environment, but instead we would transition to better over time.
Mm-hmm.
Carmen, I'm going to come to you next. The question is around, and anyone else that wants to add in to an answer on this, but this is around, as HR leaders in Boeing, what do we see as the future skills that our HR teams will need?
That is a great question. One is business acumen. And as we show up to be partners for our HR, our business leaders across the organization in a variety of ways, we need to make sure that we are business people as well as HR professionals that are coming in. And so I think that's one of the first focus areas. We've actually started launching credentialing and doing some internal badging, and HR was a pathfinder for the organization going in and getting it started. And we've seen a really great uptake in that across the organization. So I would say that's probably one of the most significant. And then for HR and every other employee, we're thinking about digital. How do we lead with a digital first mindset, which can include some traditional sort of process improvement ideas, but it's taking it that much further and trying to push ourselves to think of digitally first solutions that have never been put in place before. And I'd invite any of my colleagues to add to that what they might think as well.
The only thing I would say, Carmen, and I really like the approach that we've taken even around like the financial literacy within HR. I think about, we have the earnings calls and, we do those, of course, on a quarterly basis, and all of the work that's been put into preparing our teams in understanding how to listen, the questions, why the questions are coming in from investors. It's been really helpful in building, I think, even more literacy within the HR teams, and I think that's pretty impactful. I think people listen differently now from an HR perspective as a result of some of those tools that have been rolled out within the organization.
I would just add to that the program or the initiative we launched last year, which was the HR Development Week, was a huge success across the HR function. We did a lot of surveys of our HR team to figure out the areas that we needed to develop in. We looked at the business leaders and their feedback. And then for a week, we as leaders minimized the number of meetings and other activities that our employees would have to be involved in. And through a series of both internally led programs as well as bringing in external experts, we hosted basically a 5-day conference for our HR team, which was a huge lift, I think, and it really set the tone from kind of learning as you go to really being more strategic about your learning. The other thing that we're rolling out now is an HR Academy for Boeing, which will go to what Carmen and Pam were just talking about, which is upskilling our colleagues, us and our colleagues across the organization, plus making real examples of people who have gone out and completed either degree programs or certificate programs like some of the Cornell programs and things like that. Tiffany, I want to come over to you from a performance management standpoint, and probably you and Greg. With our change to the new performance management environment, how are we going to assign, how are we going to reward people without assigning specific scores in our new environment?
Well, like I had mentioned, we had two ways that we were evaluating employees' performance management, and through what we internal to Boeing call our annual compensation review. We're still doing the annual review that starts in January, actually, where leaders will start to calibrate and come together as leadership teams and look at what was overall outcome of the business and how did employees on the team contribute to the success or not success of the work. And then that feeds into both base pay increases as well as bonuses. We are driving to more simplicity on the what we call calibration as well as the scoring. We've historically been on a 5-point scale, and starting next year, we're moving to a 3-point scale. Didn't meet, met, exceeded, versus the 2 clicks down, met, and 2 clicks high. And so we're looking, even though it's still in place, is trying to simplify and really, it's not, the conversations on the scoring aren't nearly as important as the leadership teams calibrating on the talent and having those talent discussions that then lead into those scoring.
I don't have a whole lot to add to what Tiffany just said, but to maybe echo the importance of the calibration, and really the focus there leads to success in the next part of the phase and really helps us as leaders and then helps our employees grow.
Excellent. Thank you both. And thanks for everyone that submitted questions through the chat. Please make sure that you continue to do that. I want to go to one of the questions that we've talked about before from a Boeing perspective. So with the last 2 years being so dramatically different and hopefully kind of a once in a lifetime event for all of us, could each of you share some of the unique challenges that either your functions have experienced or you've experienced with your business partners? Some of those experiences, what you've learned as you reflect on them, and then what's going to be different going forward. And by the way, Pam, I forgot to acknowledge that it appears that you're on one of our Boeing jets. So I like your setting there. Nicely done. Way to market
Thank
the
you,
product.
Brad.
So Pam, let's go to you first, because your area has certainly been impacted over the past couple of years.
Oh, you're so right, Michael. And there are a few things that come to mind for me that we've reflected on quite a bit. We've experienced incredible volumes due to the pent-up demand from 2020, and the speed of recovery from the global pandemic. So, we've thought a lot about, could we have been better prepared for the impact of, the speed in which the vaccine was approved? We have the vaccine mandate, of course, that came out earlier this year. And then, of course, the economic recovery from the pandemic that shaped the needs of our business. And I think what we understand and what we know is that now more than ever, having a workforce planning and forecasting capability is one of the most important things for us. So we've started implementing adaptive insights, which is the workforce planning tool, so we can help the organization be more intentional about planning for their needs. What we know is that it can't just be the tool, but it's got to be the overall process to ensure we have the data from the tool, but also the information that will inform the resource requirements, because hiring recruiters and garnering recruiting talent right now is harder than it's ever been. And so being able to have some of that data for us to better serve our business, we think is one of the things that we're preparing in the future for. I think the second thing is probably more personal, and it's certainly something I think we've seen within the organization, and that's the incredible sorrow, the hope, and then also the need for change related to racial injustices that have been placed on the world, and I think also our workforce. We have an obligation to find even more ways to create not only a workforce where people can be seen, heard, and celebrated, but also invest in partnerships that will help make us even better, where we can make broader progress on attraction and representation. So I would say we've been even more intentional. I mentioned the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the partnership that we have there. They've been incredible partners, working shoulder to shoulder with us on our entry-level immersion and hiring programs. But important for us is really how do we expand that relationship so that the progress that we make isn't just limited to one talent pipeline, but for the entire organization. And that's important for not only us as a company, but I think also for many of us in HR, for the workforce that we're trying to create.
Great points, Pam. Thank you. Okay, Carmen, let's go over to you.
Yeah, I mentioned just a bit earlier about our historic reliance on really event-based development. So the pandemic has really created a burning platform for us to get more creative in how we deliver learning solutions. And so while we won't shift entirely away from event-based learning, because of course there are benefits for people coming together and building relationships, we want to make sure that we're really connecting to the flow of work and ensuring that we're driving business impact. So that means segmenting what we offer and doing it in smaller bursts so that it can be more quickly adapted and applied on the job. Another thing that we've done is we are moving away from really a level-based approach where someone moves into a position and they say, great, now I'm at X level, come develop me. And so instead what we want to do is really shift that accountability for development to some of the things Tiffany mentioned around performance enablement. So there needs to be a discussion between the employee and their manager that talks about what both need and what both are saying from a development perspective. So that regardless of the level in the organization, they can go utilize those resources. So, we'll still support really key times, or what we call manager, moments that matter. So transitions and things like that as people are moving into different levels or taking on bigger roles. But it really is going to be that shift for us to make sure we're really driving business impact.
Excellent. Thanks, Carmen. All right, Greg, how about over to you from a benefits perspective?
Michael, I would say, not all that different from what Carmen was talking about. We've had to rethink how we deliver all our programs and services. And I think we got really good at engaging with employees at a workplace. And now many of our folks don't, come into a physical workplace. And so how do we find them and engage with them successfully? And then as part of that, becoming much more proactive and not only, offering a benefit, but helping people get that benefit. So for instance, we know and we have data that there are so many people that need behavioral health care that don't get it. Sometimes it's just simply because they can't find a provider. It's not that the networks aren't large enough. There's just so many barriers. So one of the things we started to measure and then started to impact was, well, how about we make it for employees who want us to, we'll make appointments for them. So we'll ask them what they're looking for. And this, of course, it's our health plan function that does this, but let's find out what you're looking for, what you need, and then come up with a list of providers. We find the right provider, we'll get that appointment scheduled. I think the next thing we'll do is help make sure people get to that appointment, but we need to be much more proactive in helping people utilize what we provide.
Greg, thanks for that. And just for the benefit of the participants, from a vulnerability standpoint, we've had a few executives actually come out and talk about mental health challenges that they've had throughout their lives and stuff in a way to normalize it for our workforce so that people know. And just from a perspective for Boeing, we not only with the impact of the global pandemic, but as everyone's aware, with our MAX aircraft tragedies, with our 2 crashes and the grounding of that fleet, we experienced significant business impact. We've reduced our workforce from about 165,000 at the highest point down to 140,000 plus over the past couple of years, and now quickly ramping back up as you see air travel returning on the commercial side, as our MAX aircrafts are recertified around the world by the different agencies. So we have kind of gone to the peak and to the valley over the past couple of years from a workforce standpoint, and the mental health impacts that's had on our employees have been significant, and Greg's team has risen to that along with our leadership to demonstrate proper mental health care. Tiffany, let's go over to you for an answer for that question, then we'll move on.
All right. Let's see. My ad from my niche is objective measurements, is lesson learned and the challenges, a lot actually addressing what Michael just mentioned. Cultural, a company's culture leads into talent and selection and reviews. And we acknowledge that we've got cultural changes, and we started to introduce external assessments as part of our beginning of our assessment portfolio. So how do we look to hire, promote, put on succession plans, develop, is objectively pulling in a third party vendor neutral to us and having them give us evaluations on our leaders. We started with a company called GH Smart that we've partnered with on our first group of C-suite development candidates, and we're looking to continue to do that going forward, which is a big change management for us in Boeing. I think we're an engineering company, and there's a little bit of bias that our engineering helps us to accurately assess talent, and so changing that and pulling in an external partner to help is part of our lessons learned and change for next year.
Excellent. Thanks, Tiffany. I'm going to jump over to one of the questions that's come in from the participants, and that is around career pathing. So the question is, do you have defined career paths at Boeing that employees follow along with learning and training that helps them achieve kind of that upward movement? Or is it a more open and fluid type of approach? So Carmen, we'll go to you first because I see you shaking your head. Then Tiffany, anything that you would want to add?
Yes, we have all of those things. And it really depends. We have a very diverse workforce that begins if you consider a person on our production floor. I happen to be at our South Carolina facility where we make the 787. So someone coming into that type of role with the company would have a very specific career path that could be based on which position the aircraft is in when it's being manufactured, where we would do some training and upskilling there. A different approach, but even similar, is in St. Louis, where we make a lot of our fighters. People could be trained on the entirety of the jet so that when someone came into the office, or onto the production floor, they could go and work on that specific area where their skill set was needed. So we are heavily regulated, as you could imagine. So there's a lot of certifications and things that we have to have. But even in the professional space, when you think about engineers and even roles like we do have in some cases very specific paths. From a leadership perspective, I'm probably a little biased because I think you could be a leader at all levels. And so it's less prescriptive we don't call them soft skills, but in those power skills or people skills, where it's not as, like I said, not as prescriptive, but certainly open to everyone. So we have all types of things because of how diverse our workforce is.
Excellent. Thanks, Carmen. Tiffany, how about you?
I just say that Carmen's got the awesome job. Like if you've been to Cheesecake Factory and you've got this huge menu of everything to eat, that's what Carmen gets to manage, is that we've got every kind of development, external with academics, we've got internal, we've got online, you name it, Boeing has it. So I envy her that all the time. What are the gap from us is really within Boeing helping employees navigate and thread that all together. So we are being very purposeful of in our career pathing, a specific project we're working on career pathing to say, this is, I want to be Michael Cox in my career. And these are the experiences, these are the jobs, this is the knowledge that's needed to be Michael. Not so much if that was the question, like, here's the highway that leads me to Michael, but these are all of the portfolio of items that get us to Michael. That's where we're looking to get a little more finite and specific for individuals, because we, like I mentioned, on our performance and enablement is really driving into that being a bit clearer and simpler on development.
Excellent. Thank you, Tiffany. Pam or Greg, anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think they've covered it.
All right, excellent. One question, Greg, for you that came in from a participant was around exit interviews. Are we analyzing our attrition and exit interview data for any new trends and what's causing employees to leave? If so, what insights have we found? How's that informing our future total reward strategy? And then we can go to others for how's it informing strategy in your respective worlds. But Greg, how about your answer to that one?
Michael, honestly, I think that's an area of improvement for us. I mean, I think benefits often gets more credit than it deserves. They're both easy things to point to because they're very measurable. I think, when it comes to, retirement or other reasons people are leaving, it's often for vastly different reasons, and often just kind of the core of, what's their opportunity to learn and grow, and how are they treated and what opportunities are they given. So I'd defer to others on the panel, probably even have better insights than I do, because mine are pretty minimal at this point.
Anyone want to add anything?
I think from the thread of my other comments coming in of changes like performance enablement, the career pathing, the transparency on career, those are results of feedback from our employees. Whether it's on a formal exiting, here's what I didn't like, what drove me out, or in our various listening sessions, big and little, and feedback. Most of our changes from an HR perspective are coming out of results from what our employees tell us. So even the benefits Greg has talked about, it's not in a vacuum that we just sit in Chicago and think, oh, we're going to make changes. It is the feedback that we're getting, and that helps to thread and inform our decisions, and as well as the change management process.
Yeah, and Tiffany, when you...
I think...
Oh, go ahead, Pam.
I was just going to say, I think one of the things that, we're really standing up even more functionality around is, using the insights for where companies are, where talent is going and moving and migrating, and saying, there are probably places where there's skill adjacency now that the talent marketplace has to be more open. How can we also take advantage of, those pieces and parts? And we see that a lot in data that we garner from LinkedIn. And we also track information on where we're hiring people from. So we're trying to look at all of those pieces and seeing, are there some, consistent ways that where people are going becomes the, impetus for us, and how we go after and source and use that market intelligence in a different way. So I was just going to add that piece, but Carmen, over to you.
Yeah, I would just say, we're all employees as well. Now, granted, there's no exit interview data coming from all of us as current employees, but the experience that I think we have with the kinds of tools and resources we offer as an organization, we have the same expectations as employees. So, Tiffany, you were talking about sort of the ease of use. And so we've got so many resources, they can be difficult. It's almost overwhelming to see how many things are out there. So I think us looking at what our users are telling us, what our learners, what our employees are telling us, and what we experience ourselves is really, they're all key to informing strategies.
Agreed. And one thing just on this topic that we've done over the past year or so is we've moved from that traditional exit interview or annual survey, which a lot of companies do, to more of a regular pulse check and using a statistically relevant sample versus sampling the whole workforce. And it's funny for me with my career coming from Walmart, where we had 2.3 million employees globally. The head of talent used to say that we hire everyone but astronauts. After I started at Boeing, I called them and I said, guess what? I hire astronauts. So just a little bit of a demonstration of how broad our talent spectrum is here. One more question, and then if there's any other questions from the audience, please drop those into the chat. But this is looking forward, and this question will go to all four of you. As we look at the future, what are the trends within HR that we foresee impacting our company and our function? And I'll open it up with that broad of a statement. And Tiffany, let's come over to you.
Sure. I would say, when we look at leaders historically in Boeing, we often, as many US companies do, overemphasize the outcome for profit, the business outcome. What did leaders do to drive the business? And we have de-emphasized the how, the behavioral, the traits, and really significant on the work that Jessica and Sylvia put forward in Trends and Talent is empathy as an example for leaders. And for us in Boeing, and especially US-centric cultures, of the empathy of how a manager or a leader interacts and listens to their employees, whether it's work-life balance, it's working from home, it's whatever culture. Every time a leader has an interaction with an employee, you never know what's the state of that employee. They may not tell you that they're in a vulnerable state. So you have an opportunity to address that individual as a person versus an employee. So that skill on empathy, the how leaders get the work done, is definitely higher than we've held in the past, from developing and evaluating that as essential what we want leaders to be demonstrating.
Thank you, Tiffany. Carmen?
We have an initiative that we have rolled out. It's been in process now for, I guess, going on 2 years, but it's called Seek, Speak, and Listen. And that, I think, Tiffany, is an example of how we want people to engage and interact with employees, to seek out, pockets of anxiety, to listen to their employees, and encourage people to speak up and share what's happening, good, bad, and otherwise. So, what we want to do from that leadership perspective is make the development of a leader's ability to do that comfortably, even if it's an uncomfortable conversation, to lean into that and really, make that employee's life a little better perhaps that day. But we want to make sure that those development options are easy to find. They're connected to our sort of non-traditional strategies, and even bringing in things like credentials and micro bachelors and things like that to really drive an inclusive culture within the company.
Thank you, Carmen. And Greg, how about you?
I think, Michael, I look forward to the next phase of how we leverage all the power behind a diverse and inclusive workforce. And if we could think about how do we design everything we do from an HR perspective and actively engage multiple perspectives as we're doing that work so that we can achieve so much more. I don't know quite how we do that yet at a large scale, but I've seen these like nuggets of just amazing results when we engage like our business resource groups or others across the enterprise and across our communities, and just how powerful that is.
Very true. Thanks, Greg. Pam.
I've talked about a few of them because I think there's just incredible opportunity right now. You know, we've talked a little bit about the agile workforce planning and forecasting, kind of transforming the role of the managers as more of ambassadors and some of that skill adjacent attraction methodology. I mean, I really think one of the biggest things, though, that we're also looking at is driving out process complexity through the use of automation and technology for all. You know, when you think about the company built over 120 years ago, and you think about some of the processes that have become so, they're entrenched in how we operate. You know, the opportunity for us, I think, and for many organizations is how do you remove that complexity? How do you look at, the role that AI plays in a positive way? You know, AI can be really good, and I think we've all seen throughout a multitude of reports that AI can be seen as a negative. So how do you use, automation and technology for the good, simplify the way we work, change the way we work, while also allowing us the opportunity to surprise and delight candidates, right? So how we can get from the time they interview into being on board in a seamless fashion and very quick. We know there's a role that automation plays to do that, and we want to make sure that the future looks more less about a person typing, but more of how do you let automation take care of it. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing, and I think this is unique and new, I think we've always cared deeply about our team members and our workers, particularly throughout the organization. I think what's on my mind regularly is talent acquisition, and we've seen a dramatic shift. I think there were some reports that it's even more difficult to find recruiters sometimes than it is software developers. And so when I think about the future, and one of the other trends is, how do we retain, recruiters and professionals? How do we provide rewarding and engaging experiences for them? How do we grow and develop them, particularly during times of incredible stress and strain? And then finally, how do we reward them differently? And so those are the things that I think are on my mind about the future, but some of it we have to solve now, otherwise we'll be behind.
Certainly agree. The one thing I would add to everyone's answers, and that is, Pam, you hit simplification. The other piece is the globalization, right? For Boeing, we are vastly primarily a US domestic company, and Tiffany was talking earlier about changing that mindset. So as we design benefits or as we design career programs and things like that, we're thinking about a global workforce and not just a US workforce with some people outside of the US. And so we're looking at, with the 11 million open positions that we have right now in the US and the impact of the global pandemic, how can we accelerate where possible, having more resources non-US based? Because for Boeing, our customer base is global. And so whether that's on our government side through Boeing Defense, or whether it's our commercial aircraft side through all the different countries where our planes fly, our workforce needs to represent that same globalization. One more question's come in through the chat. I'll ask this question, and I think this is going to wrap us up. But the question is, how has the culture at Boeing changed now that we go beyond the physical? Because we really were, before the pandemic hit, a pretty much an in the workplace organization. That's where our manufacturing's done. It's where a lot of our engineering's done. But now that we've gone through this remote working, this arrangement for so long, how's that changed the culture of Boeing? And what do we see as some of our new cultural norms? And I'll open up to anyone that would like to answer that.
Michael, I'd say I'd start with saying pets, kids, spouses, everybody's welcome. And as part of being so focused on a workspace, I don't know, at times I don't know that we always got to meet and include everyone. And I think that's part of inclusion and welcoming everybody to be part of the Boeing family, and then acknowledging that there's going to be times, and I think it forces a positive change in our culture where you might have a dog or a kid interrupt something important from a business perspective. I think it just changes the way you have to think about things.
Or the UPS or FedEx delivery person.
Yeah. Everybody's part of the Boeing family.
That's right. Everybody's welcome. So one thing that we have done, it's really forced us to collaborate differently. We still have a heavy reliance on emails and meetings, but we're trying to bridge that gap and find some collaborative tools and technologies that we could also use. And I think that's also forced us to engage with each other differently. We start off a lot of our calls with a check-in question, and it's just something that is typically not related to work. It might be. We go around the room, and it's just a way to build connection that you think you might have had in that in-person environment, but it's very rare that everyone on your team is in the same room. So Greg, to your point, I think it's actually made us even more inclusive, because not only is, most people, and of course we're a production company, so the folks that are out there making our products aren't working remote as much, but I think collaborating differently and making and building and continuing relationships in that virtual environment, I think has been really powerful during this time.
Pam, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with what Greg and even Carmen said. I mean, I think there was a formality that existed within Boeing that, we saw on a regular basis. And many times, being in the room together was very common. There were many times meetings and conversations and things that happened because of the people that were in the room. But I think one of the shifts is we're seeing that you don't have to be in the room to be effective at times, right? You can still be on the phone. You can still be engaging with each other. I've also found, the power of the phone call. I always talk to my kids about, going back to the basics, and some of the basics sometimes are just picking up the phone and having those conversations. And, I think having flexibility and freedom to work from a variety of places gives people that opportunity to do that. And also connect on the dog barking or the doorbell ringing or sharing the home improvement project that you might have done over the holiday. Like you're starting to build different relationships that, many times weren't seen as much, and I think are really important to your happiness, feeling important, feeling seen, and engaged. And I think those are attributes that only, we're seeing now that I think are critically important.
Great. Tiffany?
My ad is, so I'm one of the longer tenured employees of Boeing, and what the change has said to me from workforce, it's only been about 6 or 7 years that Boeing was very strict on working from home. You maybe got to work from home 1 day a week, and that was your C-suite had to approve. We had gone this really hard. Everyone's on a Boeing campus. We laid people off if they didn't move. And the agility the company demonstrated when the pandemic hit to be able to work from home, frankly, was amazing and encouraging. I know externally there's a reputation of Boeing, big business, we're a little bit slow to move, we're more like the government. We sometimes say that as well, but this was an immediate, from March, April, May, in 3 months span, we figured out as a company how to get work done working from home. We're still not in the change of what's the good balance between travel and remote and coming on site. I think like many companies, we're still figuring it out, but the exciting piece for being a Boeing employee is like, we freaking did it, and we kept the company going. And this major culture, it's not just what other companies did. Ours was significant because we had such limited opportunity to work from home prior, and to be able to make that switch so quickly is a thrilling part, and that kind of stuff keeps me going at Boeing.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'll just put a final cap on that. And Tiffany, you mentioned agility earlier and some of the complexity. Boeing is an engineering company. We do really hard things. We put things in space, we put planes in the air, and we put things underwater in the sea. And we design everything to that level of engineering sometimes. And I think what the past 2 years have taught us is we went from one afternoon we were in the office to the next day no one was in the office. And then we had to figure out how we could keep our manufacturing environments going. So from a cultural standpoint, that's been a real change that I think will have a lasting impact on the organization. And I'm sure that's reflected in many of your organizations. So Brad, with that, thank you for the opportunity to join today and share a little bit about what we're doing at Boeing. And thank you for allowing us to listen to the other two presentations, because it helped affirm some of the things we're doing and then highlight some of the additional work that we need to do. So thank you for your engagement.
Oh, thank you, Michael, and Pam and Tiffany and Greg and Carmen. Really appreciate all of your insights. I think, as you said at the beginning, your presentation really kind of brought the themes that were highlighted in the student benchmarking studies to life and kind of showed how they play out in real organizations on a day-to-day basis. So I think it was really a nice capstone to our meeting, and appreciate all of your time today. That concludes our meeting. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope that you'll take away some valuable insights that will help you kind of wrestle with those talent challenges and opportunities that I'm sure you're currently facing and will face here as we eventually move into that post-pandemic environment. I just want to highlight that we'll be soon posting our kind of early 2022 calendar of events, webcasts, and working groups. So I encourage you to visit our CAHRS website regularly and keep track of our upcoming events. Hopefully we'll see you at some of those in the spring. And until then, wishing all of you a very happy holiday season and a terrific new year. Thanks again for joining us. Take care.